Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to look at how to factor trinomials where we don't have a leading coefficient of 1. So trinomials that are ax squared plus bx plus c. To do this, we need to factor by grouping. But in order to factor by grouping, we need to have 4 terms. So let's look at the 4 steps in order to rewrite this type of trinomial, ax squared plus bx plus c, so that we can factor it by grouping. Step 1, probably the most important step because you need it whenever you factor any trinomial or binomial. Factor out the GCF. If one exists, always factor out the GCF first. Then step 2 here, we need to find some value m and n. Remember, those are going to be numbers, where m times n equals a times c, our leading coefficient times the coefficient of our last term, and at the same time, those m and n values add to the coefficient of our middle term, b. Once we have those, we can rewrite our trinomial. Notice we're rewriting that middle term using that m and n. So we end up with a 4-term polynomial, ax squared plus mx plus nx plus c. Then, because we have 4 terms, we can move on to step 4 and use grouping to factor that expression. Let's look at the first example. So step 1, factor out a GCF if one exists. Well, 2, 7, and 3 don't have a GCF. So we can move on to step 2. We need to find m times n that equals a times c, or 2 times 3, which is 6. And at the same time, m plus n need to equal our b, which here is 7. So what are the factors of 6? We have 1 and 6, and we have 2 and 3. Do either of those groupings of factors add to 7? Of course. 1 and 6 multiply to 6, and they also add to 7. So we're going to use those 2 factors to rewrite this middle term 7x. So we're going to have 1x plus 6x. If we rewrite that trinomial, we have 2x squared plus 1x plus 6x plus 3. The 1x and the 6x are replacing that middle term of 7x. Now, because we have 4 terms, we can use the associative property to group the first 2 terms and then group the last 2 terms and then factor. If we look at those first 2 terms, they have a GCF of x. We factor out that GCF and we're left with the binomial of 2x plus 1. The second grouping of terms have a GCF of 3. We factor out that GCF of 3, and we're left with that same binomial, 2x plus 1. Now with these 2 remaining terms, remember, we factor out that binomial they have in common. So 2x plus 1 gets factored out, and we're left with the binomial of x plus 3. Let's look at example 2. Remember, step 1, do we have a GCF? Well, our b, -7, and our c, 5, are both prime. And they're not the same prime number, so there's no GCF. So step 2, m times n equals a times c, which here is 10. And m plus n needs to equal our b, which in this case is -7. Let's look at those factors of 10. Well, we have 2 and 5 and 1 and 10. 2 and 5 add to 7, but they don't add to -7. But if we make it -2 and -5, 2 negatives multiply to a positive, so -2 times -5 is +10, and negative 2 plus negative 5 adds to negative 7. So again, we use these two factors to rewrite that middle term. So our middle term becomes negative 2y minus 5y, or negative 7y. Our first term was 2y squared, and our coefficient at the end is plus 5. Now, we need to rewrite this negative 5y as adding the opposite. This allows us to factor more easily. So we have 2y squared minus 2y plus the opposite, negative 5y, plus 5. Now, we use the associative property to group the first two terms and the last two terms. The GCF of those first two terms is 2y. So we factor that out, and you're left with the binomial y minus 1. Now the second two terms, they have a negative 5 in common. So we factor out that negative 5, and we're left with the binomial y minus 1. Now we factor out the binomial that our two terms have in common, y minus 1, and we're left with the binomial of 2y minus 5. Now let's look at a few more examples. We're going to continue to factor the trinomial, and if we come across a trinomial we can't factor, remember we write that it's prime. So, number 3, 3t squared minus 7t minus 6. Do we have a GCF? No, we don't. So, let's look for m times n, which have to be a times c, which is negative 18 here, and m plus n, which needs to equal our middle term, negative 7. Well, what are the possible factors of negative 18? Well, we have negative 1 and positive 18, or positive 1 and negative 18, but those add to 17 and negative 17, so that doesn't work. How about negative 2 and 9, or 2 and negative 9? Well, negative 2 and 9, that adds to 7. But 2 and negative 9, that adds to our negative 7. So 2 and negative 9 are the factors we need. So we rewrite our trinomial, 3t squared. We're going to put negative 9t first, so that we're grouping a 3 and a 9 because we know they have a 3 in common, plus 2t minus 6. The order that you put those two factors in the middle really doesn't matter, but sometimes grouping them a certain way can make the next step of factoring a little bit easier. Now that we have 4 terms, use the associative property to group them. Our first two terms, what do they have in common? 3t. So we factor out 3t, and we're left with the binomial of t minus 3. The second grouping, they have a 2 in common. So you factor out the GCF of 2, and you're left with the binomial t minus 3. Now, from these two terms, we factor out that binomial they have in common, t minus 3, and we're left with the binomial 3t plus 2. Now let's look at example 4. 24x cubed minus 30x squared plus 9x. Well, this definitely isn't in the format of a x squared plus bx plus c. Notice we have an extra x, so we know we can factor out a GCF of an x. How about a coefficient? Do they have a coefficient in common? Yeah, they all have a 3. So if we factor out 3x, we're left with the trinomial of 8x squared minus 10x plus 3. Now that trinomial looks a lot more like what we're used to. So let's find our two values of m times n that multiply to a and c, 8 times 3 here, or 24. And at the same time, m plus n needs to equal our b term, or negative 10. So what are the factors of 24 that add to 10? Well, 4 and 6, or negative 4 and negative 6. Well, the only two that will multiply to a positive 24 but add to a negative 10 are negative 4 and negative 6. So we use those two factors to rewrite our middle term. Don't forget your GCF, 3x, and then we rewrite our trinomial, 8x squared minus 4x minus 6x, which replaces the negative 10x we had, plus 3. When we rewrite this with the associative property, we don't want this second grouping to start with a negative. So we're going to rewrite that as adding the opposite. And our first grouping stays the same. And don't forget GCF. Okay, now we use the associative property to group these, the first two terms and the last two terms. The first two terms, they have a GCF of 4x. So we factor out the 4x and we're left with a binomial of 2x minus 1. The second grouping, they have a GCF of negative 3 in common. We factor that out and we get that same binomial of 2x minus 1. Put it all inside brackets and bring down our GCF. Now we need to factor out that binomial that these two terms have in common. If we factor out the 2x minus 1 binomial, we're left with the binomial of 4x minus 3. And we bring down our GCF. Let's take a look at example 5. Wow, this one looks different. 3 minus 2x minus 8x squared. It has all the same components, they're just not in the right order. So let's rewrite it. Negative 8x squared minus 2x plus 3. So first we want to factor out our GCF. Because this starts with a negative, we can factor out a negative 1, which leaves the trinomial 8x squared plus 2x minus 3. Does that trinomial have another GCF in common? No. So let's find our values, m times n, which have to equal 8 times negative 3, or negative 24. And m plus n need to add to our b, which is 2. So what are our factors for negative 24? How about 4 and 6? 4 and 6 multiply to 24, but we need one of them to be negative to give us a negative 24. What if we have a negative 4 and a positive 6? That multiplies to negative 24, and it adds to 2. So let's rewrite our trinomial. We have our GCF of negative 1. We have 8x squared minus 4x plus 6x minus 3. Now, use the associative property to group your first two terms and your last two terms. The first two terms have a GCF of 4x. We factor that out, and we have the binomial 2x minus 1. The second grouping, that has a GCF of 3. Factor the 3 out, and you get that same binomial of 2x minus 1. Remember, put that whole thing in brackets and bring down that GCF. You don't want to forget that GCF. Now we need to factor out that binomial that our two terms have in common. Factor out the 2x minus 1, and you have the binomial of 4x plus 3. And, bring down that GCF. So we have factored 3 minus 2x minus 8x squared. Have a question or a factoring problem you want help with? Leave it in the comments and I'll include it in one of my next videos. If this video was helpful, subscribe to my channel for more math tutorials. Thanks for watching. See you next time.